Hi, this is History with Andrew Allen, and this is my series, The Emergence of Europe, the Fall of the Roman Empire, the Rise of the Franks, and the Creation of Charlemagne's Empire. Today is episode 27, The Frankish Kingdom is Divided Again. Before I forget, I include the names of the people I talk about and my sources in the description. As I explained last episode, Pippin agreed to support Pope Stephen against the Lombards, and King Aistulf was forced to return territory to Rome, which had become a papal republic. However, Pippin proved to lack interest in helping the Pope expand into Ravenna. Once the papacy had been made secure against aggressive neighbors, Pippin decided that it was time to regain control of Aquitaine. The duchy was determined to remain autonomous, but Pippin was relentless and campaigned there year after year for most of a decade. Resistance finally ended when the Duke was killed by his own men. Ordinarily, the Muslims of Al-Andalus would have taken advantage of the situation to expand into the region, but they were preoccupied with the civil war. Finally, Abd al-Rahman established a new emirate, but he was busy strengthening his control over the peninsula, so Pippin had a free hand in Aquitaine. While Pippin had restored Frankish control of Aquitaine, he had little time to enjoy his triumph, since he died in the summer of 768, a few months after the death of Duke Weifer. It seems likely that Pippin realized that he was dying, since just before his death, Pippin divided the kingdom between his two sons, as if recognizing that the kingdom was too large to be ruled by a single person. Charles was 20 and Carloman was 17. The obvious move would have been to organize the division around Nuestria and Austrasia, but instead, Pippin gave Charles, the elder son, Nuestria, Frisia, and northern Austrasia, while Carloman received southern Austrasia, Provence, Languedoc, Burgundy, and Alemannia. Resembling a crescent, Charles's lands were richer but less well integrated. When Pippin divided his kingdom between his two sons, he divided an entity that had been unified over decades, aside from a brief period of division before Pippin's brother Carloman had abdicated. Suddenly, noblemen and leading churchmen found themselves with lands in both kingdoms. Naturally, some were unhappy with this new division, but it was not worth revolting. If the two brothers had accepted the partition, this frustration could have been managed, but there is no evidence that either man was capable of accepting the division. Conflict seemed inevitable, but conflict between the brothers would have to wait, since Hunald II, son of Duke Weifer, decided that the division of the Frankish kingdom gave him an opportunity to retake his family lands in Aquitaine. Since both brothers held part of Aquitaine, Charles expected that Carloman would help him deal with this threat. The two brothers did meet in the spring of 769, but Carloman proved unwilling to cooperate with his brother. The official reason is unknown and may have simply been resentment towards an overbearing older brother. Regardless, Charles did crush the revolt on his own, but it became clear that the odds of cooperation between the brothers was slim. Actually, it is interesting that Charles was able to defeat Hunald relatively easily. Remember, it had taken Pippin the better part of a decade to conquer Aquitaine, and he had been able to employ the vast resources of a united Frankia. Even then, he had died shortly after his final victory, as if the ordeal had exhausted him, squeezing out his remaining will to live. Anyway, the obvious opportunity for brotherly cooperation had failed. Moreover, each brother had a son within a few months of each other, and they both named their son Pippin, as if claiming to be the true heir of their father. Unfortunately, Charles's Pippin was a hunchback, so he delayed marrying the mother of his first son. So, the question was how to handle the growing tension between the two brothers. While there were many nobles involved, a key role was played by Pippin's widow Bertrada, who wanted to prevent a horrible civil war. Whether she wanted to ensure the survival of the Frankish kingdom or simply avoid watching her two sons try to kill each other is unknown, but she clearly made a determined effort to prevent a war. As a young king, Charles's choice of bride would indicate his alliances, so Bertrada made the difficult journey to Bavaria, where she won the support of Duke Tassilo for Charles to set aside his current partner and marry Desiderata, a daughter of Desiderius, thus ensuring that Carloman was surrounded. It seems strange to ask Tassilo's permission since he was not related to the bride. Why did he matter? Well, Tassilo was a rising power whose court attracted leading clerics and had a smooth bureaucracy. Although Duke Tassilo had sworn to be a vassal of Pippin in 757, Tassilo had rarely joined Pippin's campaigns. After finally taking part in one of the endless campaigns to conquer Aquitaine in 763, he had become fed up with wasting his time far from his lands in a campaign that only benefited Pippin, so he had gone home. Presumably, Pippin considered Bavaria either unimportant or not worth the effort to impose control, since he did not invade Bavaria to make him submit. In fact, he did not include Bavaria in the lands given to Charles and Carloman in 768, which confirms Bavaria's autonomy. While Tassilo had kept peace with the Franks, he had also married a daughter of Desiderius, who had arranged for another daughter to marry Arichis, the Duke of Benevento. As a result, marriage to Desiderata would link Charles to a network of alliances based in the east and in northern Italy. So Tassilo was not being asked if he thought that Charles and Desiderata were a good match. He was being asked to join an alliance against Carloman, or rather, an alliance to intimidate Carloman into keeping the peace. A better question is, why was Bertrada expanding so much effort on behalf of one of her sons? Carloman was her son as well. Actually, Bertrada was not picking favorites. She was evening the odds between her two sons, hopefully making each reconsider an open conflict. How did Carloman get an edge on Charles, you ask? Well, Carloman's lands bordered Italy, so he had forged close relations with the papacy, which needed a protector. In response, Bertrada had first traveled to meet Carloman. Apparently, she failed to convince him to live in harmony with his older brother, so she kept going to Bavaria to win Duke Tassilo's support for the marriage alliance between Charles and Desiderius. However, the papacy was probably not enthusiastic about the marriage. Remember, the popes feared that they would lose papal independence or at least some of their lands if the Lombards became powerful. The only power in the region that could balance the Lombards were the Franks, therefore a Frankish-Lombard alliance was a threat. Actually, the papacy was occupied with its own succession crisis. Remember, Pope Paul I had succeeded his brother Stephen in 757, but he died in 767, a year before Pippin's death. A nearby duke, Toto of Nepi, arranged the election of his brother Constantine as pope. While Constantine had been a layman, there was no rule against his election. However, there was opposition within the papal administration who were angry that they had not been consulted. There was little they could do on their own, so Christopher, the chief notary, won the support of King Desiderius. Lombard troops helped Christopher's son Sergius seize control of the city on July 30, 768, around the same time as Pippin died. Toto was killed and Constantine was captured. Since Desiderius had helped out, he understandably hoped to arrange the nomination of a Lombard named Philip as pope, but Philip only lasted a few hours before Christopher and Sergius removed him from the papal throne. Instead, they arranged the nomination of Stephen III as pope. Constantine was supposed to be placed in a monastery, but Christopher and Sergius sent troops to drag him out and blind him. This treatment of a former pope seems unnecessarily harsh, but the father and son were determined to make sure that everyone understood that they were in charge. And I mean everyone, including Desiderius. A priest named Waldepert had been the main organizer of the campaign to ensure that Desiderius's nominee Philip became pope, so Waldepert was blinded as well. Unfortunately, someone became a bit too enthusiastic and cut out his tongue. Apparently, it was performed in a clumsy manner, and Waldepert bled to death. The violence was carried out by a relative of Christopher named Graciosus, who had been rewarded with Toto's duchy and seemed to want to repay the generosity, which explains the exuberance. Stephen was intended to be a figurehead, nothing more, but he and Christopher shared a desire to keep Rome independent of the Lombards, so Stephen naturally opposed Charles's marriage alliance with Desiderius. Regardless, the Pope's opposition proved ineffective. Anyway, the new leadership in Rome had much bigger problems. Desiderius felt that he had been badly treated by Christopher after helping him gain power. Ordinarily, a Lombard move on Rome would not be received well by the Franks, but he had just made a marriage alliance with Charles, so Desiderius marched to Rome in the spring of 771. He claimed that he simply wanted to pray in St. Peter's and talk to the Pope. Few of Christopher's supporters proved willing to fight a Lombard army, and some even joined Desiderius, including Graciosus, which seems ungrateful. Unwilling to send troops into the city itself, Stephen persuaded Christopher and Sergius to surrender after he guaranteed that their lives would be spared. The guarantee was followed by Desiderius. Christopher and Sergius surrendered and were sent to a monastery, but they were blinded first. The blinding appears to have been performed in a more professional manner, so they reached the monastery alive, thus honoring Desiderius's guarantee. Unfortunately, Christopher died several days later. It soon became clear that Desiderius had been motivated by distrust of Christopher, since he made little attempt to interfere in Rome. Honestly, this was the best possible outcome. A violent tyrant had been removed with minimal bloodshed, but the Lombard king did not demand territory. So there might actually be calm relations between the papacy and the Lombards. Except Stephen became ill in early 772 and died on February 1st. Stephen had had a good relationship with the Lombards, preferring them as good neighbors rather than enemies. However, his successor Hadrian had little interest in good relations with the Lombards. Instead, Hadrian demanded that Desiderius surrender the towns that Aistulf had promised to return in 756. Given the marriage alliance between Charles and Desiderius, Hadrian's actions seemed dangerously rash. Wait, couldn't Hadrian rely on help from Carloman? Or was Carloman busy preparing for a war with his older brother? Admittedly, the brothers had been moving towards a decisive confrontation until Carloman suddenly died on December 4th, 771, just a couple of months before Pope Stephen's death. The cause is unknown, but the death was probably due to natural causes. It is worth pointing out that a campaign season had passed without either brother calling out his army, so the peace might have held, well, at least for a few years, until Carloman died, which changed many things. Since he no longer needed an ally against his brother, Charles immediately ended the marriage with Desiderata. The couple was childless, which made the divorce easier. Still, the marriage itself was unimportant. The alliance between Charles and the Lombard king, her father, was key, and Charles had broken that alliance. Since Charles had gained his brother's lands through chance, not battle, he immediately rode to Carloman's capital to claim the territory and impose his will on his new subjects. In particular, the many noble families who held much of the kingdom's power and might think that they could take advantage of an inexperienced king. Charles's sister-in-law realized that he would not let her sons inherit their father's lands and fled with them to Lombardy, which simply gave Charles an excuse to meddle in Italy in the future, although it was likely already high on his to-do list. Faced with the choice of risking their lands and lives to support the infant sons of Carloman, his key followers backed Charles when he annexed Carloman's lands. Still, a marriage alliance would probably improve relations. Fortunately, Charles was now free to marry, and he chose Hildegard, the 13-year-old daughter of a powerful noble in Alemannia, which controlled the passes into Italy, yet another indication that he had plans for the Lombard kingdom. It is unknown how many of Carloman's nobles resented Charles's annexation of his late brother's land, since none actually revolted. However, one noble openly criticized Charles's decision to end his marriage to the Lombard princess in order to marry Hildegard. It should not have been a problem, except that this noble was Adelard, Charles's cousin. Adelard was the son of Bernard, illegitimate son of Charles the Hammer, and thus the half-brother of Pippin, Charles's father. Anyway, Adelard went into exile in Italy, joining the monastery at Monte Cassino. So, Francia had been reunited, although the unity was undoubtedly fragile. What would Charles do next? Given his divorce of Desiderata and his new marriage, it would be natural to expect that he would march south over the Alps. Instead, Charles marched north to deal with the Saxons, whose growing population constantly drove them to attempt to expand into Frankia. Faced with conflict with his brother, Charles had not dared launch a major invasion of Saxon lands, but once he had gained the allegiance of most of Carloman's men, he organized a campaign in 772. Penetrating deep into Saxon territory, Charles destroyed the Irminsul, a huge ancient tree that was viewed as a shrine that helped to hold up heaven. The destruction of a major pagan religious site was meant to cement his status as the Christian leader and show the Saxons that his god was superior. The campaign had also produced huge amounts of loot, convincing the nobles that following him would be financially lucrative. As ever, the financial aspect was crucial. Charles needed to reward his followers, but if he took land from nobles in Carloman's former lands, they might decide to re-examine the claims of Carloman's sons. So the Saxon campaign ensured that the northern border was secure and avoided any problems with Carloman's followers. Actually, most of them had probably submitted on the condition that they would keep their lands. Undoubtedly, some particularly difficult or loyal nobles lost their lands, but most did not. So, why risk a war that they would very likely lose, which would mean that they would lose their lands and possibly their lives? The following year, Charles was considering the target for his annual summer campaign. Suddenly, a message arrived from Pope Hadrian asking for help against the Lombards, who had occupied towns that were part of papal territory. Apparently, Desiderius had even threatened to force his way into Rome. Was Desiderius really planning to attack Rome? Since Hadrian had arranged for the arrest and execution of Desiderius's key representative in Rome, it appeared that Hadrian had intentionally provoked a dangerous neighbor in order to convince Charles to intervene. Regardless, Desiderius was undoubtedly aware that a conflict with the papacy would give his expansionist neighbor an excuse to invade, so it would have been advisable for the Lombard king to ignore any provocation by the pope. In fact, Charles even attempted to find a diplomatic solution, sending Desiderius an offer to make a generous payment if the Lombard king abandoned the papal towns. Apparently, Desiderius was confident that he would prove more successful against the Franks than his predecessor Aistulf, since he rejected the offer. Well, Desiderius would soon have an opportunity to test himself against the Franks. Admittedly, the Lombard kingdom was a more dangerous target than the loosely united Saxon tribes. Still, the Frankish kingdom was larger than when Charles's father had marched across the Alps nearly 20 years earlier, so it was unlikely that many Frankish nobles opposed Charles's decision to invade the Lombard kingdom. To sum up, when Pippin died, he divided the enlarged Frankish kingdom between his two sons. In theory, the brothers would live in peace with each other, but it soon became clear that they were not capable of a harmonious relationship. Instead, each brother began making alliances with neighboring powers in preparation for a climactic showdown. Charles, the eldest son, made a marriage alliance with the Lombard king, while his younger brother Carloman tried to ally with the papacy. However, Carloman died suddenly, and Charles quickly gained control of his brother's lands. Meanwhile, Desiderius, king of the Lombards, had helped Pope Stephen deal with a violent tyrant who had attempted to control Rome. Naturally, Stephen was grateful, but he died, and was succeeded by Hadrian, a more aggressive pope who asked for Frankish help to regain lands taken by the Lombards. I will discuss Charles's invasion of the Lombard kingdom next episode. Thanks for listening. If you liked the episode and want to support me, I include a link to my Patreon in the description, or you can buy me a coffee.